back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don joining you today. For our longtime listeners, today is going to be something of what you might think of as a throwback episode. Back in the early days of the podcast, it was not uncommon for us to have what we call a solo episode. But thankfully, we've evolved beyond that as we've built the team to include many of the voices and personalities that we know our listeners enjoy. And so there's not as much need for a solo episode. And I'm thankful for that because, as I've said so many times during other episodes, we are better as a podcast because of who has joined the team and having more than one person on the podcast. It's actually a tough thing to do a solo recording, even though it sounds like it may be simpler. But today I'm bringing this solo recording out of a couple of reasons. A, just for that throwback element is part of it. But B, because this is a topic that is sort of near and dear to me, and I'll explain why before we get into it. So I think I mentioned perhaps on a previous episode, perhaps the one where we were interviewing Chris Coppola, just about what got him into his interest of history. I think I told this story, so I apologize to listeners if you've heard it, but it is very relevant to the story that I'm going to be telling today and the fork that we're going to pursue. When I was growing up, I was very fortunate to be blessed to live in a middle-class family with adoptive parents who adopted me at birth, who loved me a great deal. God could not have chosen better parents for me than he did. And one of the neat things about where we lived up was that we did not have full wooden fences in our backyards. We had chain link fences. And so very often it was the chance to not only see but visit with the neighbor next door, not just over that chain link fence, but you could even see through it. And both of our neighbors on both sides of where I grew up as a kid, we had a relationship with. That was back during the day when that was a little bit more the norm. And particularly one neighbor that lived on one side of the house, whose name was Mr. Brown. And he's a very key, important part of this story. I should say that I am a fan not only of history, but also of aircraft, and particularly historical military aircraft. And if you talk to anybody who has those similar likings, they definitely have their favorites throughout history. And for me, there are a number of planes that would fit that category. But if we're talking about the World War II era for me, and anybody who knows me knows this, I'm sitting in a room where I'm looking across and seeing a large picture of one of these aircraft. For me, that's the P-51 Mustang, particularly the D variant of the P-51 Mustang, which I will argue is one of the best fighter aircraft of any era compared to its peers, but certainly was one of the best fighter aircraft of the World War II era. Now, my connection to the P-51 over time actually goes back, and Mr. Brown is an important part of this story. Back when I was a kid, my guess is this is probably around the age of 7, maybe as old as 8. My parents bought for me my first model to put together. It was an airplane model, and they chose this for me. I didn't choose it. But the model that they chose for me was a P-51 Mustang, again, actually the D variant. And to give you an idea of how old I was, this was not even a model that used glue. This was one of the snap-together models, if you're familiar with them. But I put that model together, was very proud of it, put the decals on, and actually managed to get them straight, probably with the help of my mother or father in terms of keeping the decals straight. And so I was actually on our back porch one day playing with this model plane, the P-51 that I'd put together. And Mr. Brown happened to be in the backyard and happened to see me playing there. And he said hello to me and asked what I was doing. And I showed him my model and walked over to him. And he sort of took it in his hand and he glanced at it and looked at it. And he says, "Do you know anything about this plane?" Now, I was old enough to read, but certainly not old enough to really understand the context of a lot of things, particularly related to history, other than what was there. And I told him, yes, it's a World War II fighter aircraft, and et cetera, et cetera. And then he asked me if I understood the importance of the plane. And I basically said, I don't think so, other than obviously it looks cool, right? And so what I learned that day, and we came to have subsequent discussions about it up until the day that he died, was about the importance of that plane. And what I came to know that I didn't know before that point, and really came much later to understand had significance, was that he had served as a navigator on bombers during World War II. And so he was very, 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 very attached to what the P-51 had meant for him, and we'll talk about that as we go through the episode, because the P-51's impact on the air war in Europe, and thus the war in Europe, was profound. And so he told me about the importance of the P-51 in terms of it was the aircraft that could actually go with them on these missions as they flew into the daytime bombing raids into Germany and other targets during the war. And the P-51s would actually escort the bombers. Again, I don't think I fully grasped in all the detail that I do now him telling me that story when I was 7 or 8, but it certainly made an impact on me. And from that point on, not just because of its beautiful aesthetics and the things that I learned later about its performance, even more so about what we're going to talk about today, or I'm going to talk about today during the episode, was the significance of that to him and what it meant to the war effort. Later, when he died, while we were attending his funeral or the visitation there at the funeral home, had a chance to visit with his wife, who I did not have as much of a relationship with, but certainly had talked to her on occasion. And so she made some comment about how much Mr. Brown enjoyed talking to me. And I made the comment to her that I enjoyed talking to him, particularly when he would tell me stories about his participation during World War II. Now, by this time I was a teenager and certainly had a much greater understanding, had read books and had watched things, that had me understanding more about the significance of what was there. And so he and I could have more intense and detailed conversations. And she was taken aback. And I asked why. And she said, well, because he never talked about that. Now, probably he felt a little more comfortable talking about that because of the experiences that anyone that went through the trauma of World War II. I think there's a reason, to borrow the phrase from Brokaw, the greatest generation, the sacrifices and the things that those who fought during that war and served during that war saw were profound and affected them for the rest of their lives. But she was surprised that he had shared that with me because he had rarely shared it with anyone else. And so that made it an extra privilege for me to know that he and I had had those conversations, and perhaps I'd been an outlet for him to talk about and to share those things. So when I come to this topic today, I come to it with not only the affinity for a historical event, a historical item in the version of a historical warplane, but also in terms of the context of that conversation with a beloved neighbor and what we shared all the way back from early in my childhood. So enough of the background here. Let's talk a little bit about why I've chosen this as a topic today and what our historical fork was going to be. When you listen to military historians, particularly those that focus on the aviation war and the air war in Europe during World War II, a common theme that you will hear is that the introduction of the P-51 as a bomber escort had a profound effect on the outcome of the war because for the first time, bombers were able to be escorted all the way to their targets and all the way back from their targets, even deep into Germany and even into German-occupied territory beyond Germany, Poland, other places as well. And so prior to the introduction of the P-51 as a fighter escort, and we'll talk a little bit more about even things that flow off of that here, it had been the case that the other aircraft that had escorted the bombers, primarily a fantastic fighter plane, and those who would probably be an advocate for it as strongly as I am an advocate for the P-51 as being at the top of the list of Allied fighters during World War II. The submarine Spitfire was used in that role. Eventually, the P-47, again, also quite an effective fighter aircraft in its own right, was used for it. The P-38. But the P-51 was unique in that it was the first aircraft that had enough range and the ability to function at altitude to go deep. And we're talking about deep into territory and stay with the fighters all the way. Before that, as I was saying, the fighters would escort up to the point of their range, to their fuel limits, and then they would have to turn around and go back to base, leaving the bombers to fly in formation, using their gun turrets and staying in formation, being able to protect and cover each other. That was their defense about being able to go deeper to reach their targets inside of Germany. And so what would happen is, as tends to happen during war and tactics tend to develop, is that the German fighter aircraft came to understand that there were points at which, be it the submarine Spitfire, the P-47, whatever was escorting the bomber formation, would have to turn back. And so they would linger beyond that range before they would begin to attack the bombers, the Allied bombers. In this case, it was the U.S. bombing during the day, during the daytime part of the bombing campaign. They would wait until the fighters had to turn around, and then they would then they would engage the bombers. And as a result, if you look in the period primarily from 1943 forward until the early parts of 1944, although there was a sort of a pause or a little bit of a gap during the winter of 43-44 in the Allied bomber offensive, after they started the combined bomber offensive, which began in 43, up until early 44, this situation existed. And as a result of that, the losses were tremendous. In fact, there was even discussion. There was an entire change of leadership inside of the U.S. component of the Bomber Command in late 43, moving into 44, because of the loss rates and the attrition rates, where it was not uncommon to have missions lose 50% plus of their bombers. And on average, you were seeing numbers of between 15 and 20% losses being across the board. Something that was simply not sustainable in terms of just the material, and certainly not sustainable in terms of the loss of life when you realize that these bomber crews ranged from 8 to 10 souls on board, and very often they exploded in air, and so it was a complete loss of crew, or the number of Allied prisoners that came to be as a result of the bomber crews being captured behind enemy lines. So when this change happened in early 1944, it's a crucial point in the war. So the what if today is what would have happened if there had not been the introduction of the P-51 Mustang to be able to escort bombers all the way through. So part of also is understanding how this plane came to be, and I've attached some things in the notes for you to go back on that. It's an interesting story because the P-51 sort of grew out of an interesting project in 1940 when the British, this is now before the U.S. entry into the war, were looking to beef up the fighter aircraft they had at their disposal. They had the wonderful submarine Spitfire, and crucial to the Battle of Britain and the situation there in terms of stabilizing the situation in Europe, making it almost impossible for the Germans to get air superiority over the British Isles, and thus preventing them executing Operation Sea Lion, their planned invasion of the British Isles, because it required upon, at a minimum, having air superiority, if not air supremacy, and the Spitfire had prevented that from happening. And of course, there had been Lend-Lease, and so there were American aircraft that were being flown by British pilots. They came looking for more of those American aircraft, and what they came looking for in 1940 was for the organization that had created the P-40 Warhawk, also particularly a famous looking World War II fighter aircraft, to be manufactured by another company. And so what happened instead of that, instead of licensing the P-40 Warhawk designed to someone else, when they went to Curtiss Aircraft, they discovered that they had ideas for a new aircraft that they suggested would be built from scratch that would be a superior aircraft to the P-40. That became the P-51. Now, that was an unusual thing in the fact that time was of the essence. And so developing, producing, and getting into operational status a new fighter aircraft essentially from the drawing board in a short period of time seemed like a daunting task. But the things that they saw, the British here, in the capabilities of this new aircraft made them willing to do so. And I've included, again, some links in the show notes to some YouTube videos and other resources that can tell this story far better than I. And I don't want to spend so much time on that, although that's a fascinating story about how the P-51 came to be. They did that very quickly and turned around literally in a matter of months to where they actually had prototypes and then were able to go into production on the P-51. That was the P-51A, which was a very capable aircraft. Had superiority when it came to areas like speed, had a number of other things that made it a remarkable aircraft compared to some of the other options that were out there. But it wasn't until later. And initially, by the way, the one drawback that it had, this is important to understand, the one drawback that it had was not its speed and capability, was not its maneuverability, but was its ability to perform at altitude. Even though it had superior range to a number of other fighters that were being used by the British at this point, it did not have the ability to perform well at altitude. And so the initial deployment of the P-51 was primarily as a ground assault fighter bomber, and it was very successful at doing that, particularly in the areas post the loss post Dunkirk and the Germans digging in and building Fortress Europe. It was used effectively in missions against ground targets inside the European theater, but it was pretty much limited to that role because of its inability to perform well at altitudes above 18 to 20,000 feet. What eventually happens, though, is this wonderful marriage between this airframe, which was a superior airframe in so many ways. That's why the British were convinced to take P-51s instead of additional P-40s that would be built. But when it was married to a new engine, instead of the original Allison engine that was deployed in the P-51, it ended up with a version, which could also be produced in America because Packard had a license from them, of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was the power plant of the submarine Spitfire, one of the things that made it such an exceptional fighter. And one of the things about that engine was its ability to perform well at altitude. It was very efficient in terms of fuel consumption. It was very powerful. And so once you married the airframe of the P-51 in its original format with a new engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, something very, very special was created. As a result of that, the P-51 did not lose any of the characteristics. In fact, it improved some of the characteristics that it made it effective up to that point during the war, but it gained a new capability, and that was the ability to perform well at altitude, something that is important if you're going to be escorting bombers. And so eventually what happens in 1953, moving into the latter part of 1953, as they're using other aircraft in this escort role, as I described, they don't have the range to go all the way with the bombers. Eventually, they come to realize, with the change in command of the U.S. Bomber Command, that the P-51 may be a better tool to utilize for this because of its extended range and its ability to perform well in all the aspects that were needed. They also developed the capability of drop tanks for additional fuel consumption so that they could even go further and then conserve their main fuel resources for being able to engage in dogfights and other activity. And so by early 1944, the P-51 had become the primary aircraft that was escorting bombers into Germany, successfully going deep and also providing effective air cover. And this dramatically changed the losses for U.S. bomber aircraft during the daylight raids and made it such that the German fighter aircraft could not simply linger beyond the range of the fighter escorts, waiting for them to turn back. Now they had to face the fighter escorts. There were additional evolutions in tactics, which are also an important part of what's here, in the sense that as Jimmy Doolittle took over the command, an innovative, for all kinds of reasons, an innovative aviation war figure prior to World War II and certainly during World War II, is that he also enabled, because of their range, because of the capabilities of the aircraft, the P-51 would not just simply stay with the bombers, but would actually begin to probe ahead of the bombers because they had the range and the capability to do so, and engage German fighters before the German fighters were even engaged with the bombers. That change in tactics in 1944 was also a crucial aspect of what changed the air war in Europe and changed the capability of being able to reach targets, to effectively utilize bombs against German industry, to disable German industry and production, which obviously had an impact not only on the air war, but had an impact on the war in general. Doolittle also, because the P-51's capabilities, still retaining strong capabilities to have that range, carry the payload, be able to carry bombs, in addition to being an effective fighter. He empowered those P-51s as they moved ahead of formations and after they had escorted bombers to go on raids of opportunity against ground targets, be they trains or other positions, other industrial positions, and actually engage in additional small bomber in the form of a fighter here that's capable of carrying bombs, but small bomber capabilities against the Germans. So while historians will debate the actual effectiveness, and they later do equip the drop tanks and other things to enable P-47s and P-38s and even Spitfires to a degree to have the range to escort the bombers further on their raids, the P-51 was the vanguard plane in this change of tactics with fighter escorts for bombers in Europe. So it arguably does have an impact on the war and what's there. Now, the historical what if. What if there had been no P-51? I'm not going to argue that without a P-51, that it would not have eventually been Allied success in the war in Europe. And I'm not going to argue that they would not have continued the bombing capabilities. I'm certainly not going to argue that eventually there would not have been provisions made for the other planes that I've discussed here to be able to do a better job of having extended range and being able to support in the bomber escort mission. However, having said that, at the time that the P-51 assumed that role, really beginning in late 43, certainly in early 44, there was no other plane that could assume that role. That's right. It is fair to think, I believe, that you would have had the continued concerns moving into 1944 of resuming the bomber campaign post-winter with more fervor, but not having the significant reduction in the losses to materiel and crew to planes and men that happened here. And so one of the things I think that is a potential outcome of not having the P-51 is it would have been a much longer period of time for the Allied bomber offensive to achieve the objectives and the goals that it managed to achieve pretty effectively moving through spring and into summer of 1944 in such a way that it was inevitable that they were going to be able to severely impact German manufacturing capability simply with the capabilities of the bomber campaigns and the air war. At this point, you had also seen the development of more radar technology. The British, with their night bombing, were being more precise. It literally was a 24/7, 365 air offensive that was being conducted by the Allies against German, the heartland of Germany, but also German-held positions in Europe. And again, thinking about the timing of the success of this moving forward, again, early 1944, this enabled more of the ability to expedite effectively the Normandy invasion in June of 1944. One of the things that I would argue without a P-51 is you would have had this interesting conundrum. It's less likely that you would have had the reduction in production of tanks and aircraft by the Germans ahead of the D-Day invasion, and so you would have had more capability, more material at the hands of the Germans to defend against D-Day and ultimately the Allied invasion to retake the parts of occupied Europe. The flip side of that is you might have seen more of a push for the need to launch an invasion simply because you could not win this war or begin to change the outcome through the air war. You were going to have to put troops on the ground, and eventually you were going to have to fight your way to these German manufacturing capabilities to disable them, not being able to destroy them or severely limit their outputs simply by an air war. And so I think it's a potential consideration to discuss is that the impact of not having the P-51 could have either been a delayed D-Day invasion, a less successful D-Day invasion, or actually the requirement to look at other invasion options, Normandy being one of the locations, but others as well, simply because you were going to have to land Allied troops into Europe and begin to move forward in order to make the gains and to do some of the things that the air war was successful in doing in the real timeline that in this alternate timeline would have been less successful. It's also easy to imagine if you continue to have losses and attrition at the rate that would have existed without the fighter escorts, that the ability to actually conduct the air war campaigns would have been also substantially impacted, probably lengthening even a successful air war campaign by a year, maybe 2 years or more, simply because you would have had to have more bombers produced to replace those that were lost, not just to enhance or to grow the bomber fleets, but you also would have had the tremendous buildup of the loss of Allied bomber crews. Eventually, at this point in the war, I think it's fair to say that the Americans were committed to the war, and even though those losses would have been extreme and tough to bear back at home, they would have continued, but just actually being able to have a force flying, a bomber force flying as you're losing bombers at that rate would have been much more difficult. And so I think it's easy to argue that eventually the air war in Europe would have been continued and sustained with less success as early as the success was actually seen in 1944, the substantial change in the rate of success. So it would have been longer. But it also would have been far more difficult and would have required more time simply because the manufacturing needs to catch up to fill the losses that were there. It's also, I think, very important to understand that the P-51's unique role that I mentioned there after the tactics were changed, the ability to fly ahead of the bomber formations, and then the ability to attack targets of opportunity as a result of being given free rein to do so, also had a very substantial impact on the war. And without the P-51, that tactical consideration would not have been possible. And so even when you had the ability, perhaps with an extended range for a P-47 or the P-38 that was coming online or the submarine Spitfire, it still would have been a more difficult challenge because while those fighters would have been able to go with the bombers further and deeper towards their targets, they would not have been able to engage in this tactical shift of being able to go ahead of and supplement the bomber attacks. And so you would have a different style to the air war in Europe, even as the other planes came along and became capable of extending their range and supporting the bombers. And so, again, there's a lot of potential what-ifs that are here, but I think the two most important what-ifs to understand is the number of lives that were saved for American bomber crews as a result of the introduction of the P-51 and the change created by the capabilities of the P-51, both on tactics and upon the success of the strategic campaign, had a substantial impact on the air war in Europe. And on the air war in Europe, the bomber offensive particularly, changing its success rate changes both the duration of the war and how the war may have been prosecuted. You could argue that not only did P-51s save the lives of American bomber crews, but they saved the lives of American infantry that would have been lost as a result of the need for other ground operations, perhaps additional invasions similar to that of D-Day that would have been necessitated because the strategic objectives of reducing the capability of German manufacturing would not have come into being as quickly or as effectively without the P-51. So, hope you've enjoyed this episode today. Again, it's a personal episode for me because of the topic. Part of the reason I wanted to do it as a solo episode, plus it's something that I had more interest in than the rest of the team, that tie back to my next door neighbor, Mr. Brown, thanking him posthumously for his service and for all those that served during that war and the role that they played. So this is Don signing off for this episode of A Fork in Time. Next time when you come back, you'll hear more than me, and that's a good thing with the rest of the team. If you haven't had a chance to check out our website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com, certainly suggest that you do so. There you'll find our past catalog, the back catalog. You'll find information, the ability to give topical suggestions, to give us feedback. As always, we encourage you to join us over on our Discord server, which is where we have more real-time conversations with our listeners. We've gotten to know some of them better there. We'd like to get to know you better there, so there's a link in the show notes for how to find that and engage with us there. We just recently passed a milestone for the podcast, so I just want to mention this. We are now over 150 downloads for all our episodes historically. We know we are not the largest podcast on the internet by far, but we're very proud of the fact that we've now sustained well over 200 episodes. And even though we don't have a large listenership measured in terms of thousands of listeners, we know that we have a loyal listenership, and we certainly appreciate you. We appreciate your interaction with the show. One thing I just mentioned here, we don't suggest it often because, again, the role of our show is not to be a money-making operation. But if you want to participate in helping the show financially, you can find the ways to do that both in the links through our Patreon page and other ways that we offer there on the website. We'd encourage you to do so. There are benefits to doing that. I know one of our listeners really enjoys the fact that he gets to hear these episodes a week plus ahead of the rest of our listeners, because one of the benefits that our patrons get for as little as $2 a month is the ability to have early access to episodes. But there's other perks as well. And certainly if you want to represent the show, check out our store where you can find things like our shirts and mugs and other things that are here, just as other ways of letting folks know our existence, and hopefully other folks that might have an interest in alternate history may find us as well. All right, this is Don signing off. Until next time, our suggestion is always for our listeners, if you happen upon a fork in time, maybe it's worth taking. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.